most, if not all of us are here today. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the next American Encounters series, and our guest today, as most of you know very well, is Sabine Sielke. And I met Professor Sabine Sielke in Opole, in Poland 3 years ago at a conference, and she gave a great talk on memory studies. I was really very much impressed. It was better than some of the keynote lectures. And I invited her to come and give a lecture for us in Warsaw, but then the pandemic happened. So we kept postponing it, but finally she is here today, and you will be able to listen to her in person. Professor Sabine Sielke is the director of the North American Studies program at the University of Bonn, and a mentor at the Foundation of German Business. She's also a member of the editorial board of America Studien, American Studies. It's one of the most influential American studies journals in Europe. It would be impossible for me to list all her academic achievements and publications. She was a visiting scholar at the University of Queensland, Brisbane, at New York University, and for many years she was an associate and fellow and non-resident fellow as well at the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute for African and African American Studies at Harvard. It's not her first time in Poland and in Warsaw. In 1999 she was a senior lecturer at the University of Łódź, so she's no stranger. She has edited more than 10 collections of essays, and here you can see some of the covers. And as you can see, they are devoted to a variety of topics, from nostalgia and gender studies to Orientalism and the intersection between cultural studies and natural sciences. And Sabine has a diploma in biology as well. She is the author of Reading Rape, the Rhetoric of Sexual Violence in American Literature and Culture, published by Princeton, and her earlier book, Fashioning the Female Subject, the Intertextual Networking of Dickinson, Moore and Rich, was published by the University of Michigan Press. Her research interests are also very wide, and they include 19th and 20th century American literature and culture, with a focus on poetry and poetics, modernist and postmodernist cultures, literary and cultural theory, gender studies, African American studies, 20th century art, popular culture, and the dialogue between cultural studies and natural sciences. At the moment, she's working on 2 individual projects: Memory, Mediation, Seriality, Re-cognizing Literary and Cultural Studies, Remembering the Subject, which interfaces methods and research questions of cultural studies and the cognitive sciences, and explores the potential of such transdisciplinary dialogue for our sense of cultural practice. Her second project, Science into Narrative, explores how contemporary US-American fiction translates science into narrative, and foregrounds how some scientific endeavors are continuous with literary discourse, while others clearly resisting narrative or not. So now you can probably understand why we are also very excited to welcome Sabine in Warsaw. So the floor is yours. I will close my brief presentation, and this is your water.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. There are a few gentlemen here in this classroom. The majority is female students. It's the same in Bonn, so I feel quite at home in many ways. I thank Anna Pochmara for her generous introduction, and of course also a generous invitation to Warsaw. It's wonderful to be here, and I thank you all for your interest, for being here today. Dr. Pochmara was in Bonn last week and presented a wonderful talk on her book on temperance and excess in the early African American novel. And we enjoyed her visit very, very much, and I'm very happy that I can be here tonight, today, not tonight. We're doing it tonight in Bonn. Let me say a little bit about my interest in issues of memory. I've been interested in the topic since the so-called memory boom of the 1990s. And it has to do with the fact that we visit museums, and I do visit museums in the US as well, which work quite differently, and I'll say a little bit about that as I go along. I'm also interested in memory, and Dr. Pochmara mentioned the book on memory, mediation, and seriality, because I work on questions at the crossroad of cognitive science and cultural studies concerning memory. When you do that, you see that memory can mean so many different things. On the one hand, we have cognitive science that talks at an extreme end about action potentials in our brains when it comes to memory. And on the other hand, we talk about issues like identity politics or identity practice when it comes to memory. So we're actually talking about very, very big issues and often incomparable issues when it comes to memory. So that is the scope of the topic in many ways. I think what is also important for me was the sense that when we talk about memory, or since we have been talking so much about memory, we've also lost track of talking about the future. And I think climate change, as well as Omicron variations of the COVID pandemic, has sort of redirected part of our attention to the future as well. But there were times in cultural history when people talked much more about the future, like in the 1920s when we talk about futurism, or in the 1980s, even the aesthetics was more future geared. There was a lot of silver and a lot of or less retro aesthetics in 1980s culture. So we also have to look at forms in some sense. But I think the preoccupation with the past is quite central to our culture. Having said that, we also need to think about the fact that when we think about the past, we always do that with a focus on the future as well. We look at the past in order to actually deal with the future or with the present and the future. And this is also how memory works. When you go out in the street, you have to remember to put your shoes on and to remember how to tie the shoes, right? So you recall something that you learned in order to be able to cope with what is ahead. So past and future, of course, also interrelate. What got me started into memory cultures was, in many ways, my visit at the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. in 1995, a long time ago. And this museum did interest me not because I wanted to know what the Holocaust is or what happened during the Holocaust, but because I was interested how American culture narrates our history. And I got out of the museum being quite irritated because American culture tells our history in very different manners. Whereas Germans tend to talk about the Holocaust in documentary modes or symbolic modes, the American approach to history is one to relive history, to experience history. So the sense is you go into the museum and you get a passport of a survivor and you bond with the survivor and you walk through the museum sort of experiencing, you're invited to experience the Holocaust, which of course is impossible. And interestingly enough, they they also shipped over a train compartment from Poland, which was used to get Jews into the concentration camp, and the Polish institution repainted the train compartment to make it look better, and in the U.S. they took off all the paint and re-authenticated the train compartment because they wanted the visitor to sort of have the experience to be in that train compartment. So this really sort of infuriated me because I thought, you can't relive the Holocaust, you can't relive history, right? And so this sort of worked on me for a couple of years, and then I started to write about these issues and write also about this particular visit. And later, I've gotten back to my original training. I was supposed to become a school teacher for English and biology, so I studied biology as well, and I got interested into that former interest. So that's when I got into neuroscience. But this talk is not about neuroscience. It is really about our ways of dealing with monuments. So I start my talk now, which comes in, oh actually, wait. Statues of famous figures in world history are currently under severe attack. And this iconoclasm, literally, this image breaking, this recurring impulse to destroy cultural artifacts for political or religious reasons, is by no means a new phenomenon. Yet while some activists promote the quick disposal of monuments honoring characters whose heroism may appear questionable in hindsight, and whose ongoing display seems to affirm and foster racism, others fear that, along with those contested sculptures, we dispose of our sense of history and become all too forgetful. In what follows, I mark some of the front lines of these so-called culture wars, whose concepts and strategies have been adapted from US American debates and get appropriated for often incomparable historical contexts on foreign turf. And we may not just think of German or Polish memory cultures for that matter. We may also recall that in March 2001, the Taliban blew up the gigantic Buddha statues in the Afghan Bay and Valley, and in the course of this destructive act pulverized unique pieces of world heritage. Likewise, the warring parties in Syria, not unlike ISIS, looted cultural sites such as Palmyra and sold what they could grab to buyers in the West. And yet, just like the demolition of monuments of cultural heritage, recent debates about statues, street names, and other sites of memory in public space are by no means a novelty. Instead, they are part of a continuous conversation about what we like to remember as our history and what we prefer to forget. Interestingly enough, the iconoclasm we witness on US American territory goes hand in hand with what scholars labeled memorial mania, a continuous rise of memory sites, and a remembrance of people and acts that historiography likes to fade out or move to the margins of our attention. All of this has raised the question whether we can sort good modes of memory from worse or really bad varieties. We may also wonder, though, how newer monuments, such as the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial on the Washington Mall, which was dedicated in 2011, harmonize with older memory sites close by, including the Thomas Jefferson Monument, built in close vicinity to the White House during the Second World War. After all, King was a black civil rights leader, whereas Jefferson, founding father and third president of the United States, was also a slave owner. And why, I wonder, are debates about cultural self-conception, or what goes under the term cultural identity, ignited by sculptures, art objects, and architecture first and foremost, so it seems? How do conflicts around forms and figures of cultural memory in the US and Germany differ? And I'd be very interested to hear more about that conversation in Poland too. In Germany, Otto von Bismarck, the first German chancellor, is under attack. Street names like Mohrenstraße, Moore Street in Berlin are at disposal, and German police forces too are faced with accusations of distributing racist or neo-Nazi propaganda on social media and of violent attacks against visual minorities. Recent cultural conflicts in the US and in Germany thus appear comparable, even as their historical context and discursive framework differ considerably. And this difference belongs with what we like to forget, and rightly so, at least in part. For without forgetting, our memory would be insufficient, and this is also what neuroscience actually knows and tells us. And these are some of the issues I zoom in on and like to discuss with you today. And this discussion is also framed, I think, by yet another debate that has kidnapped our attention. Currently, we talk somewhat obsessively about an increasing polarization of US American as well as our own societies. And this polarization often gets manifested in our handling of history and in a practice of cultural memory, which includes monuments and museums as much as names of city, streets, and public places. While some fly the Confederate flag, others decapitate Columbus or pull Jefferson off the pedestal. And where some affirm their right for self-defense by calling on the Second Amendment, others rally against systemic racism and police violence. Significant to me is to acknowledge that this polarization is to a large degree an effect of where the media direct their attention, and what in this way turns out to be particularly salient. Media thrive on drama, on sensation, on the spectacular. They take much less interest in the ordinary, the day-to-day, even as new formats are day-to-day matters. And it is media-compatible scenarios, first and foremost, that frame the struggles around memory cultures and the politics of memory. My talk comes in 3 parts. I'm at the end of my introduction, and in part 1 I talk about iconoclasm, so this destruction of images that comes back again and again serially, and I talk a little bit about why memory culture in fact needs a culture of forgetting as well. In part 2 I look a little bit more at what is called memory or memorial mania, the rise of sizes, the rise of museum cultures, and the numbers of museums that have been founded in recent years. And I also look a little bit closer at the German context, which is close by for you all. And as I said, I'd be interested to hear more about the Polish discussion. And in part 3, I return to the place that I mentioned in the introduction, namely the Washington Mall, and look a little bit closer at the Mlk Monument that was erected there in 2011, and look at how we could understand monuments better when we contextualize them, and sort of talk about the relationship to other monuments on the Washington Mall. So I come to part 1. iconoclasm and its many returns, or why memory practice needs a culture of forgetting. Let's start with Columbus, the explorer who supposedly discovered America and who at the time of his death in 1506 was almost forgotten. In the 19th century, we hear he was rediscovered and remembered by Italian immigrants as an emblem of plurality. This legend, so many commentators stipulate, needs to be put at rest now, once and for all. Columbus, so the argument goes, not only embodies the multiculturality of a white America. Celebrating Columbus also honors the heritage of a settler colony that eradicated an indigenous population and a nation that evolved as a slave economy. Modeled on a man uncovered as a kidnapper and genocidal maniac, as critics have it, Columbus replicas have turned into an endangered species. In June 2021, within just a few days, 3 such monuments became the target of well-intended vandalism in Massachusetts, Minnesota, and Virginia. Well-intended for some because directed against sustainable systemic racism. In St. Paul and Richmond, the figures were simply pushed off the pedestals. In Boston, Columbus's likeness was decapitated, its marble head sent rolling down the street. In Germany, such actions, and the historian Hermann Lübbe speaks of a powerful emancipatory practice, received much applause. And yet, blaming Columbus, a singular agent for the colonization of North America and all its aftermath, cuts matters a bit short. Such presentist personification simplifies complex historical processes and constitutes a problematic approach and a truly American practice. All along, we easily forget that Columbus opened the paths for many individuals, from the Puritans up to refugees from Iraq, Burma, and the Ukraine, who were persecuted for their religious beliefs or political leanings, as well as for immigrants who economically had nothing left to lose. Remember Janis Joplin's lines, freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose. Moreover, if we agree that Columbus has turned persona non grata, should not the Republic of Columbia or Columbia University or the numerous Columbia colleges in the US, not to speak of the District of Columbia, consider a name change too? And I have to mention here that when I took over the chair of American Studies in Bonn in 2001, a long time ago, I inherited from my predecessor a traditional lecture that we do every year, the Columbus Day Lecture, which has been under attack for years now. What we did in this lecture is, it is dedicated to transatlantic exchange, and I always introduced the whole thing by talking about this problematic legacy and by talking about that, of course, you couldn't discover a country that was already populated by indigenous people and so on. So we always problematized that. And now my younger colleagues, but also many students, sort of would prefer an Indigenous Day lecture. And I have a colleague, meanwhile, who will do that. But I still resist taking the Columbus Day lecture off our program, because if we take it off, we cannot problematize the whole issue, right? We would sort of push it out of sight and out of mind. And so I'm in some sense a dinosaur, sort of insisting on the conversation, but I think it's important to keep the conversation going. So I've been defending the Columbus Day lecture in recent years, but we will pair it with an Indigenous Day lecture, and I think it's good to have both of them. So evidently, these debates circumnavigate the complexities of history. They also tend to sideline that monuments are simply associated by way of metonymy with processes consistently renegotiated in historiography and shape-shifting in cultural practice. As such, memory sites are points of crystallization for crucial cultural conflicts, now often augmented into culture wars. And we should mind our language and the register. I think war is not the right kind of word, but it's being used, of course, because we dramatize what we do in culture in many ways. In the US, these wars serially re-engage the fundamental contradiction that is quite literally constitutive for the American nation. On the one hand, the Constitution of the United States proclaims that all men are equal, and until 1920, of course, that meant males only. At the same time, the Constitution legitimized slavery. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, respectively 1865, was followed by Jim Crow legislation. And even when that was outlawed, the economic, social, and cultural hierarchies resulting from this history of conflicted race relations persist to this very day. Yet it seems unlikely that culture wars manage to resolve these far-reaching race and class matters. Instead, with their practice of image breaking, these culture wars, some commentators insist, often make us forget history and the crucial conflicts that paved the path to our contemporary lives. We cannot undo history, publicist Theo Sommer claims in an op-ed column for the on the German case of Bismarck. Yet indeed, historical consciousness is having a hard time nowadays. Digitalization privileges synchronic experiences of temporality over a sense and sensation of time as a linear process. Accordingly, our consciousness of historicity seems to evaporate. At the same time, the claim that we cannot undo or rewrite history rests on the mistaken assumption that we have indeed agreed on a common and consensual perspective on the past, which is by no means the case. In fact, along with the memory boom of the 1990s, the growing significance we have assigned to individual memory of past events has not only transformed conceptions of history, it has also challenged once again our sense of what Maurice Halbwachs termed collective memory. For Susan Sontag, no such memory exists. For her, all memory is individual, unreproducible. It dies with each person. What is called collective memory, she reasons in her 2003 essay regarding the pain of others, is not a remembering, but a stipulating. That this is important, that this is the story about how it happened, with the pictures that lock the story in our minds. End of citation. The past comes into being when it is narrated, Peter Reichel argues, along similar lines in his 1995 book, Politics with Memory. Written down or represented within monuments or days of commemoration, scholarly interpretations, or epic works. The measure, therefore, are motives and modalities of construction which mark events and protagonists as significant and worthy, and which assign the past with a particular relevance for our present time. And as the remembering individual or community constructs contemporaneous memory, this affirmation of the past comes to frame individual and collective memory. End of citation. In other words, history emerges with memory cultures which assign relevance selectively and may thus reaffirm and update, yet also call into question and rewrite individual and cultural self-conceptions. Iconoclasm is a central part of this memory practice. Moreover, As we know, the shape of history depends on the perspective of the observer. This is for some time now, scholars prefer to speak of history in the plural, of histories. And this is why different parties may refer to the same historical moment with different terms. What the US refers to as the Vietnam War goes by the name of the American War in Vietnam. And this is, some of you may know, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., which was much celebrated when it was opened, designed by Maya Lin. And it has the names of all the soldiers that were fallen in the war. 55,000 or 58,200 names on it. And the idea is that the visitor is reflected on the surface of the memorial, so that you interact somehow with that past, and that it is in this way also your own past. And it's quite an interesting memorial. But my point here was that the Vietnam War in Vietnam is the American War, right? Not the Vietnam War. And so this is how perspective comes into our sense of memory also. Accordingly, when it comes to sites of memory, viewpoint is of crucial importance. Who builds a memorial with what legitimation at what point in time? What form does a particular memory take? What aesthetics engages the visitor? What styles are referenced or cited, and to what effect? With their specific aesthetics and shapes, monuments transport their own spatio-temporality, which more often than not marks a considerable distance to what observers recognize as currently popular or dominant artistic and architectural styles. Therefore, the target of current attacks on controversial monuments is not history, but forms of memory, which quite necessarily are modes of forgetting as well. According to Reichel, remembering and forgetting thus necessarily constitute two sides of the same consciousness of history. At the same time, these seemingly opposite poles of perception are constantly played out against each other, as the author observes, for various reasons. Be it because remembering is considered morally, cognitively, and culturally a highly valued capability, while forgetting counts as a naturally or willingly activated inability. Be it because the interdependence between both capabilities, remembering and forgetting, this interlocking often gets ignored. Or be it because in tendency we overestimate the drive of political agency ascribed to collective memory. As does art historian Julia Kalter-Feldman, for instance, who holds that statues and street names not only reaffirm convictions that had formerly inspired them, they also reinforce, she believes, a dynamic of repression that informs our present. End of citation. Making her case, Feldman seems to forget, though, that modes of oppression have transformed, and political movements have also celebrated groundbreaking successes. When I was at Harvard, I often talked to an African-American man, an older man, who was actually working at Harvard since the 60s, and who was then working at the admissions office, and who always insisted, and I was at Harvard in the 90s and later, insisted that so much has changed, and we often forget that. I'm not saying that racism doesn't exist in the US, there's lots of problems remaining, but also a lot of things change. And we tend to forget that. And of course, this also means that these achievements are not necessarily bound to stay. if we think of the abortion debate that we have right at the moment, Roe v. Wade, but also politics of affirmative action, which has been criticized quite a bit in more recent years and decades. So these achievements are not necessarily around to say if political movements have achieved a change in a certain political situation. This is also why I think iconoclasm often functions as a skip action, a sideshow, a performative act of identity, practice, and politics more than a politics of history. In the larger context of these debates, we may also forget that the critique of monumental memory cultures is by no means a novelty. Many 19th century commentators did not consider dead stones an appropriate medium for successful memory work. And for over 100 years, the living memorial movement in the US has engaged in alternative memory practices, such as performances that are neither widely promoted, nor recorded, nor meant to leave traces to posterity, but that constitute a memory solely for those present at the time. Likewise, the felling of monuments does have a long history in US American culture. After the 1776 public reading of the Declaration of Independence in New York, a group of men, including George Washington's troops, toppled over the equestrian statue of King George III, displayed on the tip of Manhattan in 1770, an act that was understood as a symbolic regicide. By contrast, the controversial Confederate monuments erected in the south of the US since the 1870s owe their stability to the consensual racial politics that dominated US American culture until the 1960s. In the second half of that decade, protests against statues of Confederate soldiers, like that displayed on the campus of the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, rose in amplitude. Ever since, in communities all over the country, Confederate memorials were removed from public space. Just as the Confederate flag decorating public buildings, they had become a stone of contention, yet remained resistant in many places, as did Silent Sam or the innumerable monuments honoring Confederate General Robert E. Lee. Many of these contentious signposts stood their ground until the recent protests against systemic racism and police violence. In some places, the ongoing presence of heroic Confederates was challenged with counter monuments, such as the statue for Black social reformer Frederick Douglass, revealed in 2011 just across from the non-yielding Confederate monument at the County Court of Easton in Maryland. In 2017, ultra-right protesters mobilized against the plan of the city of Charlottesville to get General E. Lee off his pedestal, and as we may well remember, the conflict escalated. Trump America against College America, the German magazine Der Spiegel diagnosed, projecting a polarity which downplays that Confederate monuments have been at the center of protests against racial discrimination long before Trump openly considered the US presidency a career option, and that was in the 1990s. I come to part two now, memorial mania, good and bad monuments, and a change of memory location. In recent decades, the iconoclasm we have witnessed in the US has been synchronous with the memorial mania. The term is, on the one hand, inspired by a growing number of alternative memory sites, including the Cancer Survivor Park in Indianapolis, which honored men and women who survived cancer, or the Rosie the Riveter Memorial in Richmond, California. On the other, memorial mania refers to the boom in new museums. Even human rights and visions of the future, meanwhile considered endangered species, have become objects of museumization. In the Canadian city, Winnipeg, the Museum of Human Rights opened its doors in 2014, and since 2019, Berlin proudly displays fantasies of what may be ahead at the Futurium, the House of the Futures. Likewise, German memory culture is quite agile too, and attends to numerous construction sites, ranging from our colonial past to the German Empire, to National Socialism and the history of the German Democratic Republic. In tendency, the German approach is as restorative as it is Americanized. With the architecture of the Jewish Museum in Berlin, designed by Daniel Libeskind, or Peter Eisenman's memorial to the murdered Jews at the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin, German memory culture adapted, or shall we say appropriated, the effective US-American take on history in general and the history of the Holocaust in particular. Some also call it the Disney approach to the Holocaust. And I already mentioned that American museums or American approaches to history is often the attempt to relive history. So in the Jewish Museum in Berlin, we have Libeskind's Holocaust Tower, which should impress itself on the visitor as irritating, as disconcerting, as disruptive. And in the US, of course, we have also the tradition of reenactments of historical events or battles in Williamsburg and in other places. So that is also a sign of that approach. And of course, that is never a revisiting, and can never be a revisiting of the historical moment. And as I mentioned before, while Germans had the approach to look at the Holocaust in documentary modes, first and foremost, the Stelen and the 6 cylinders that were built by Eisenman, who's an American architect, were a new way of experiencing our past. Since we were used to documentation, the Germans also added to that monument a place of information, ein Ort der Information, which is a very German approach. So we supplemented the monument, or we felt the need to supplement the monument with that information center, which is actually very successful. I think it's very well done. I was very resistant because I thought, well, that's so German to add that, to explain what has happened. But it is done in a new way, and so I think they've done a very, very good job there. At the same time, cultural critic Henning Bly observes that what he considered an advance of neo-feudalism in Germany witnessed best, he holds, in groups of toddlers whose parents call on kids named Sophie Charlotte, Eduard, or Karl Friedrich. And these are names that recall famous royalty or feudal history. The current Wilhelminization of first name, so Blyle, is part of a bourgeois desire, a retrospectivity whose value system rests on pre-democratic ground. Up and down the country, and we're talking about Germany, facades of castles mushroom like Potemkin villages, and monuments for figures of feudalism find financially potent sponsors. Taken in their entirety, Blyle holds, these phenomena are telling, and I quote, "Since globalized modernity results in an increase of personal and social insecurities, a growing part of the population longs for moments in history which promise manageability, clear-cut conditions, and a decisive division between up and down, high and low." End of citation. To put it differently, German memory culture somehow synchronizes its politics of history to current economic conditions and the increasing distance between social classes by celebrating German dynastic history. According to Blyle, it is grotesque to honor or not nostalgically glorify a Kaiser, an emperor, who fired a pragmatically thinking Chancellor Bismarck and led his country into doom. And yet, in the course of an ongoing interrogation of German colonialism, Bismarck has lost much of his appeal too. But can matters be resolved if we simply remove monuments such as Hamburg's enormous Bismarck monument from public view, out of sight and out of mind? Or should such sites remain stones of contention, supplemented by captions that explain why supposed heroes of world history may perhaps have been less heroic than the monumentality of our monuments mean to suggest? After all, simply banning Bismarck in the moss box does not accomplish much. More effective and quite original sounded the idea of historian Jürgen Zimmermann. He suggested to undo Bismarck's heroic appeal by turning the statue upside down, laying it sideways, or partly burying it close to the Hamburg Wharf, the Landungsbrücke. Too late now, however. The 9 million refurbishment of the 34 meter high figure has been on its way for some time now. In the light of such controversies, we may wonder what figure in world history may indeed hold up with some consistency to our transient and continuously shifting values, moralities, and ethics. Especially when it comes to renaming streets such as the Mohlenstraße or Moore Street in Berlin, there seems to be no end to erasure and overwriting. After all, Kurfürstendamm, a prominent Berlin location whose name resonates a feudal past as well, does not sound politically correct either. The same goes for the Kaiser Karl-Ring, Emperor Karl Circle in Bonn, where the city considers renaming several roads, including the Hindenburg Circle, the Werner von Braun Street, and the Victoria Bridge. Yet another idea is to do without such names entirely. After all, everyone who had a public office is likely to have failed at one point. Yet even locations are not innocuous, as the debate around the so-called African Quarter in Berlin-Wedding indicated, where streets carry the names of former German colonies. Curiously enough, though, Africans have always been drawn to this neighborhood, in part because it was affordable. How would they feel if a lesson in post-colonial critique meant that their neighborhood was wiped off the Berlin city map? Likewise, after reunification, some Berliners mobilized against the public presence of Karl Marx, subjecting GDR history to a gradual forgetting. Only after a longer controversy, somebody noticed that the Karl Marx Street in Berlin-Neukölln was not recalling the famous philosopher, but a former Neukölln mayor who had the same name. And just as a side note, it is in part due to the demolishing of GDR architecture, the wrecking of the GDR Palace of the Republic, and the reconstruction of the Berlin Castle in East Berlin's center comes to mind. It's only because of the demolishing of that architecture and history that many young Germans now begin to rediscover and reclaim the GDR as part of their identity. And only because memory practice is so forgetful could the corona pandemic be deemed by some the largest impingement on our since 1945. Just as if the GDR and its travel restrictions lasting for 40 years did not exist. Yet again, through the end of GDR and Soviet Union, and more recently, claims concerning Marxist anti-Semitic mindset provide sufficient ground to delete the memory of Marx from public spaces and dispense with his philosophy on the garbage heap of history? How about Thomas Piketty's much discussed 2005 update of Marx's Kapital? Evidently, all of this is a matter of perspective. The Chinese government, for instance, felt that the city of Trier, Marx's birthplace, was short of a crucial monument. Right on time for the 2018 bicentennial celebration of Marx's birthday, they donated a Marx statue by sculptor Wu Weishan, and we will see how long that will be stable and stand up there. In fact, though, monuments tend to have a short life, and those erected during National Socialism or Stalinism are prime examples. Architecture is a bit more robust, even as we keep discussing whether the Berlin Olympic Stadium should be cleared of part of its Nazi aesthetics. Currently, this conflict centers on a few individual sculptures, as architect Volkwin Mark notes, making a plea for a local documentation center. So again, the plea is documentation in Berlin. Yet let's not forget, enlightening and glorifying are not necessarily at opposite ends. Scholarship can be both critical and reverential, not to mention the fact that enlightenment does not have much currency these days. And I come to part 3 and to the end of my talk. And it's entitled Open Spaces Between Monument Protection and Demolition on the Future of Memory Cultures and Cultural Wars. In 2019, during the Independence Day celebrations at Mount Rushmore Memorial in Keystone, South Dakota, Donald Trump announced his plans for a task force for building and rebuilding monuments to American heroes. He envisioned a national garden of American heroes that gave shelter to statues for John Adams, Frederick Douglass, Amelia Earhart, Antonin Scalia, and many others. In a response published in the Washington Post, journalist Alexis Kerr in turn proposed a new home for all fallen monuments. In the light of this ongoing memorial mania, I wonder whether we may adjust our view and find a different approach to public memory landscapes. By way of conclusion, I would therefore like to take you on a stroll across the Washington Mall, a central site of US American cultural self-reflection. There we find, since 2011, in close vicinity to the monuments of Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln, the indeed monumental Martin Luther King Jr. National Memorial. And here you can see a map of the mall, and the monuments are sort of in vicinity or in one line. Up there is on the left the Lincoln Memorial. Then we have Martin Luther King down there, and the Thomas Jefferson Memorial down there. I also marked on the very right the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Then there is a National Museum, which is fairly new, of African American history and culture. And the Vietnam Vet Memorial is up there, sort of right over the Lincoln Memorial. That's sort of the site. Did anybody visit the Washington Mall? Okay, yeah, okay, yeah, understand. If you ever get to Washington, you will certainly stroll over this monument mile. Well, the official credo of the landscape design claims a close connection. Okay.
It'll get back.
Oh, it gets back, yeah. A close connection between these figures. The fundaments of both Jefferson and Lincoln have become somewhat shaky. This is why we may want to approach the triumvirate as cornerstones of a cultural self-reflection, as voices in a trialogue that operates with divergent forms and aesthetics of memory processes. Curiously enough, and despite its remarkable size, I had some trouble finding the MLK Monument during my last visit in Washington, D.C. In retrospect, this search was as telling as was taking in the memorable object itself. I thought it a quite irritating kind of monument in many ways. Dedicated during the first Obama administration, the walk in memorial for the Black national hero Martin Luther King seems as gigantomaniac as the Mount Rushmore National Memorial. Built in a city whose inhabitants are 50% African American, the MLK Memorial seems politically as much as aesthetically fallen out of time. And what, we may wonder, would Dr. King have thought about the opening of the site, starring many African American celebrities, including Stevie Wonder, Aretha Franklin, Jesse Jackson, and Obama? It had taken decades, the engagement of innumerous prominent and less prominent people, and lots of money to put MLK on a pedestal. Memory cultures are big business, and prime locations are in high demand. Thus, it comes as a surprise to me, at least, that the team around Chinese artist Li Yixing, known for 150 monumental statues, among them several Maoist sculptures, was selected to assemble King from 159 granite blocks. Martin Luther King remade in China, impersonating the very action-oriented Marxist that in hindsight Senator Jesse Helms considered MLK to be. Now, what is the effect of superimposing Mao and the aesthetics of socialist realism onto our image of the celebrated civil rights leader? Oddly enough, the look and feel of the MLK Memorial reminded me of the many statues toppled over after the fall of the wall in 1989. At the same time, its design is both somewhat rearguard and symptomatic for current global power relations and geopolitical conflicts, first and foremost, the economic rivalry between the US and China. Just as the democratic spirit of the so-called founding fathers fades with the imperial gesture of them all, this new yet undoubtedly dated appeal lets us forget how down-to-earth and close to the common people MLK aspired to be. Even more so, in this Marxist-Maoist apparel, Dr. King seems quite distant from the neighboring monuments, the bronze Jefferson and Lincoln in his marble palace. It is most likely that King would have felt quite uncomfortable in their company. After all, what did he have in common with the slave owner Jefferson? And even though the memorial for Lincoln, who in 1863 brought the Emancipation Proclamation on its way, became an impressive stage for King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech, exactly 100 years later, Lincoln and King are by no means like-minded spirits. Lincoln's politics aimed at maintaining the Union, that blacks would politically participate in US American society and culture was hard to imagine for Lincoln. He favored their repatriation, despite the fact that many African Americans were born in the US and fought in the Civil War, as the African American Civil War Memorial in Washington recalls. It comes as no surprise, therefore, that some Lincoln statues, such as the Freedmen's Memorial Monument to Abraham Lincoln in Lincoln Park, also in Washington, D.C., are held responsible for reaffirming white supremacy. The sculpture shows Lincoln with the Emancipation Proclamation standing over a kneeling African-American man just liberated from slavery. Though financed by free blacks, the monument still presents African Americans in a submissively dependent position. Rather than removing artifacts that witness such mindset. Such monuments may also remind us that US American culture has indeed come a long way, as Obama repeatedly insisted. Thus we can well imagine how Jefferson, the Bronze, and the Memorial Lincoln fell into shock and toppled over when in 1963 the Washington Mall morphed from central memory site into a prime location for political protest. Perhaps Dr. King would have followed their example when people took to the streets once again in response to the rallies provoked by an ongoing police violence against African Americans and an administration that poured oil in the fire in the summer of 2020. We may all wonder what goes through King's granite mind in light of the serial repetition, the recursiveness of such events. Yet if Jefferson and Lincoln got banned from the mall, which is very unlikely, Dr. King would be left quite lonely and decontextualized. Instead, we should keep the conversation about the shape, design, and aesthetics of our memory landscapes and cultures ongoing, and in the process work on bridging the social distance that seems to widen. Should this dialogue and bridge work stall, we may build them a monument or dedicate a museum. Better, however, I think, let us not getting to that point in the first place. So I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for this great lecture. The analysis of the Mlk Monument was brilliant. I saw the images. I haven't seen it in person.
Yeah,
Really
it's quite a weird experience, I think.
So we still have about 20 minutes, 15, 20 minutes for questions. So I'm sure that Sabine will be happy to answer. Right, we already have some questions before, perhaps I'm sure that Susanna will have a lot of questions as well. I also encourage our students to ask questions. You may ask them in person, but also the lecture is advertised on Facebook as an event, so if you don't feel comfortable speaking in public, you may simply write the question into the chat below the event, and I will read it out, and Sabine will also answer it. So, right,
Yes. First, a comment and then a question. The comment is about the Vietnam Memorial, because we have the names of those many young people who died. And what I find interesting is how it erases something that in the 1960s was central to the debate. LBJ, how many kids have you killed today? The first of all, the sending of American troops to war that Lyndon B. Johnson carried out, but also the obligation to enter the Vietnam War that was JFK's initiative, something which today is forgotten. And that kind of seeps into my question. When we talk about monuments, we have this binary opposition: good guys, bad guys. It's even less nuanced than in comic books. Comic books are literally much more nuanced than this. So we see this fetishization of individuals in monuments, which goes back to the fetishization of individuals in American culture. And how would you comment on the problem that this is associated with? That for a lot of people, the things on the monuments, the people on the monuments are supposed to be monumentally good. They're supposed to be praised. There is this problem that people have when we start criticizing the people on the monuments, and as you absolutely correctly said, all of those people did something wrong, and there have been books written about all those people in which everybody can experience it. Would you say that in our interacting, in our understanding of memory through monumentization, this problem of fetishization of those individuals, they have a monument, they have to be ultra good, is problematic because it causes us to strive for an idealization of human beings, which is impossible. We are flawed creatures.
Yeah, I think, I mean, those monuments speak to the fact that we sort of personalize history or associate it with certain figures and forget other figures in the process. And I think memory cultures have reacted to that by constructing monuments in a different way. So that is problematic, and as I said en passant, it's very much an American approach to history as well, to personalize it. You know, you hunt down certain, enemies, and then the problem is solved. That's often what we get suggested by the American debate, and of course things are more complex. And this is part of the problem of these monumental figures. At the same time, I would always think that as a viewer, we always experience them, or often experience them, as something that is from a different time. We're able to see that this monument was not built yesterday, right? That it comes out of a particular context. I find many of the monuments on the mall kitschy, even the new ones for the Korean War. I thought, I don't know, that looks really dated, even when it was set up. But we need to be aware that these monuments also show us how our forms of remembering change, and you're perfectly right, the personification of certain wars, events, developments is problematic. And even if we have more figures, I mean, often the system is to blame, ideologies are to blame, that you can't really aestheticize or put into particular form. It's very difficult, I think, if you wanted to have a complex monument and people wouldn't, you would have all these captions up there and the documentation center next to it, so to speak, to explain how this actually works. So there needs to be a certain simplification, but personification is certainly guiding us into the wrong direction.
Yeah, I mean, it eclipses debate.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's true.
Thank you.
I just wanted to add something, because like personalization and also like some monuments which are kitschy, which also brings us to the question of the form of monuments, because I remember when Maya Lin's project was made public, like many veterans protested that it's not like figures of soldiers fighting, which would make it so personal, right?
Yeah.
It's like abstract, right? So it's also like this, these conversations about, what makes a monument a good monument, right? Or like the monument which sets the right context for the narrative.
Yeah, I think it always depends on our expectations, how we actually want history to take form or want memory to take form. And I could imagine veterans thinking this is too intellectual, the whole idea of interactivity, and that I get engaged into the process of memory. I mean, this is quite abstract in many ways, and it needed explanation at the time for many people, and I think this is also true for many museums, and this is why some museums use a register that tries to cover or take in everybody, and for a visitor who's more intellectual, cuts it down, and so I think it's a very difficult kind of work, and the fact that we have so many monuments and museums also, I think, reflects the attempt to do things right, or to be able to approach everybody in some sense, but of course you can't. But it's a very good point. The celebration of that monument may not have included everybody involved.
Is there anybody else?
Certainly not the Viet Cong or the North Vietnamese.
Yeah, it was only the veterans. It was the Vietnamese.
Yeah.
American.
American.
Yeah, right.
Only
Yeah.
Americans.
Yeah,
The
right.
other
Of course. The others were
The others, you
forgotten.
can forget
Yeah,
about
yeah.
them. Yeah.
And we visited Vietnam, and of course there the memory is very, very different. So you get, in museums, you get the history of Agent Orange, how it has affected the population up to now. This is of course a narrative that you don't necessarily get in the US. So it's completely different. And I found that I didn't even know that they would call the Vietnam War the American War. I didn't know that, right? Because the Germans also call it the Vietnam War, right? Yeah.
Susanna Ładka.
So I'll try to, yes, I have many questions, but it was fascinating. So yes, but I'll try to just narrow it to 3. My first would be, what would be your opinion on somehow connecting the emergence of this memory mania to the emergence of the internet, because we're in the 1990s. So in the sense of the symptom of snapshotting history becoming augmented as if due to that. So that's, what would you say? The second is, would you agree that this what you call the need for forgetting, or the demand or requirement for forgetting something as we memorize other things or highlight other aspects, that this has to do with the general, let's say, problem with the public misunderstanding of this double meaning of representation, because it seems like, speaking in psychological terms, that people seem to be adopting those attitudes towards monuments in a manner in which they feel represented or demand to be represented by someone. And representation, of course, means 2 things, right? The manner in which you use Columbus Day, right, and meaning as an illustration of history to paint the picture of, and the manner in which the picture or sculpture represents, like speaks in the name of, right, the famous Marxist distinction, right, Darstellen and the portrait. And so. And my third question is about the practical stuff, meaning not practical stuff, but about individual monuments. I'm really curious your opinion about was there in Harvard Chapel. It features names of war casualties who were students, Harvard students, at the time of the Second World War. And I was really surprised by seeing several names that were German names which said enemy casualty, but they're all listed there on the walls of the chapel. There are the names of American students and also of German students of Harvard who are commemorated as enemy casualty. Nevertheless, they are not erased from the memory. And yeah, and the part of that question, really a 4th question, is about 9/11 memorial. How it plays with this, in the sense that it plays with the idea, here nothing is represented, right? It's somewhat a copy of the Veterans Memorial to some extent, but at the same time, the whole aesthetics is about the aura of mystery that the event is shrouded in. Yeah, so I know, I'm sorry, but I just feel free to go where.
I try, and I answer from the back, so to speak. The 9/11 monument, site, whatever it's called. I think I can't see it without sort of thinking of the history of that monument, because it went through all these debates, how it should look like, and it turned out monumental, of course, and so it's very hard for me to look at it without remembering the history of the making of the monument. And in some sense, it's sort of, I mean, 9/11 was supposed to change or have changed the world. Of course it didn't, because many of the changes were already on its way in the 1990s when, for instance, securitization, and we're at such a different moment in history now. It has aged, it doesn't age very well, I think, because, I mean, why go there now, right? You know, because we were involved in some, people go there, of course, and I've been there. So I think, for me, I've dealt a lot with 9/11, and we had a couple of conferences and so on. So I can't take that out of that context. Yeah, that the German students who are being remembered in the Harvard Chapel, I think they were at Harvard at the time, I understand, right? Or what was it? No.
It just says, I never talked to anybody about this, but it just says
Okay.
May, right?
Yeah.
And then the enemy casualty. Which is interesting from the perspective in
Or
which you were
they were at
presenting
Harvard and then were in the war, or?
that they were
Yeah.
in the war, but nevertheless Harvard students. So Harvard is a
Yeah.
separate reality as
Yeah,
it's not.
exactly. You're giving that interpretation. So they were Harvard students. They must have been good. You know, they couldn't have been Nazis or whatever.
Mhm.
I think that's sort of implied, and of course nobody knows, right? So,
But it's
if I
interesting how
understand.
it stands next to this argument about polarization, right? Because here it wasn't made
Mm.
because Harvard is
Yeah,
the center of
I think I find it quite surprising how we actually reaffirm certain, I said this yesterday, dualities, certain polarities that we have deconstructed over the decades, like in the second half of the 20th century. With deconstruction, post-structuralism and so on, we deconstructed binarism. In the 1990s, we celebrated all kinds of multiple differences. And now we're talking about people of color, and we sort of sort in that group Asians who don't necessarily consider themselves people of color. All others are people of color, and then we have whites, right? So we have this polarity, and this reinforces something that we have already questioned. And I think there's a lot of racism involved in that. But it happens in a different moment, so it's a very different kind of polarization than we have had it, or the USS had it in the 1960s or before that. But it's sort of scary, and I think it also happens with gender relations. I mean, the whole debate about Roe v. Wade changes gender, or tries to rewind gender matters in certain ways. So, yeah, and that I think that is scary stuff. Forgetting is important neurophysiologically, because if we would remember all minute detail of our day-to-day lives, we would go crazy, right? We would go nuts. So we need to forget also. But you talked about, you know, representation, and representation is important to realize that, as I said, monuments are metonymically associated with certain processes, right? Or they work on a symbolic or level, or as tropes. And what I think is part of the problem is that we tend to read, or let's say maybe younger observers tend to read literally, right? The level of, you know, representation is often ignored. So the figure is impersonating something, and there isn't, yeah, okay, impersonation is also a trope, of course, but I think one problem is that we read things literally, right? That we don't think about how something performs, or how something works as a trope, as a metaphor, on a more abstract level. And I think that becomes part of the problem at the moment, that everything is taken literally. You know. And the first question, yeah, you said that you suggested that memorial mania is related to the digitalization.
I think you just answered my question in a sense, because you said we take things literally, and I meant that the internet and so the proliferation of information, and also the visualization of that this is something that plays into what you call this snapshotting of reality, and treating monuments as snapshots of
I think,
and you said that we take things literally, and I think this is connected to my question also.
yeah.
Because there's been this
I also-
anxiety that there is so much we have to select something that means something about us and our history.
Yeah, and the internet on the other hand gives us all these options, right? And this is how also historicity gets lost, because everything is on a synchronic level. You know, it all looks alike. I mean, we remediate everything into the same medium, right? Into zeros and ones, and onto a surface. So the differences are very hard, I think, to detect. And it is also a multiplication of, group interests on the internet. And so you have a museum, or you have a cancer survivor park, or these examples. I mean, there's nothing to be said against it. Why not have a cancer survivor park? But you could have these parks for any kinds of groups, right? And so every position is supposedly necessary to be recognized and acknowledged, and this is also an effect of the internet, that every little group finds its echo chamber, right? And so I think it is related, and the multiplication of media, of course, also shows in museums themselves that you have different kind of museum, that interactively engaging somehow in a museum, which doesn't necessarily teach you much about, the course of history.
Have you been to Poland, the Polish Jewish history museum?
Yeah.
What do you think about it?
We saw, I think we only saw part of it, right? I'm not quite sure, but I thought it was very good. And I mean, this is years ago, right? They may have changed something. What did you think?
Because it's made in that real living.
Yeah.
But maybe less so than the one in Berlin. This was my first, I think, experience with that kind of museum. When I entered the tower, that imitates a gas chamber, I think. The door closes behind you. You're sort of in total darkness. There is an echo. It's supposed to be terrifying, a terrifying experience. So in Poland, in Warsaw, we don't have that much of this kind of.
As much as I remember it, so it's a little while ago. Yeah.
I think we have the time for one last question. Someone in the audience?
Yeah,
Could you introduce yourself, please?
I'm Natalia, and I have a question, more like a personal opinion of yours. Do you think, because we talked about the monuments which might be problematic, do you think there are any monuments or statues which are so problematic that they cannot be saved by any sort of information that this history is problematic, or perhaps it still is a part of history and it should stay?
That's a very good question. I never thought about that. But one should think about it. I can't think of any right now. But then there may be some that I don't know that should be gone. I don't know. Would you have anything in mind?
What about Hitler?
Yeah, for example.
That's right.
Well, of course, yeah, but we don't have Hitler monuments, right? Do we?
No, but we had quite a lot.
We had, yeah, of course. But I thought you meant now.
No, I mean, if there were any...
Yeah, I mean Hitler, Stalin, and so on. Yeah, and they're gone, right? That's why I also said normally monuments have a short life, and yeah. No, but I thought if I could think of any monument right now, there may be figures I don't favor. But still, I would always appreciate when it is explained why this figure is there, because if we just put them off the public space, out of mind, out of sight, so to speak, that doesn't help us at all. Yeah, I don't. We'll probably talk about the Polish discussion on memory sites after the lecture.
There is another museum that actually is made in this Disney mode, even more than Poland, and it's the Warsaw Uprising Museum. I don't know if you have.
Oh, okay, no.
So the problem with the museum is that obviously we lost the uprising, but people who visit from abroad who don't know the actual history of the uprising are convinced when they leave the museum that we have won, that it was a huge success.
Yeah, but that's how it works. That's how it works. And it seems to work. So it needs a capture in front of the museum. So
Or a careful reader.
Yeah, that's right.
All right, so I think that we are out of time. I have so many questions, but we'll
We'll deal with them.
Okay.
you.
All right,
Thank you
and
very
thank you
much.
so much,
Yeah.
and thank you, Sabine, for
My pleasure.
Annyeong.